Could you imagine a situation where the Ayatollah is captured or even killed by the US?
Yes, absolutely. I think we've crossed that Rubicon with Maduro. I don't think there was, as there shouldn't have been, probably any kind of global, international outrage that a leader of a foreign country was targeted in such a way. I suspect, even though it would be atypical, that the world would not react too terribly awfully if Khamenei was removed.
President Trump has just authorized what military analysts are calling the most explosive foreign intervention in modern American history, and the reaction across the globe reveals the absolutely catastrophic implications of such an unprecedented action. For decades, tensions have been escalating between the United States and Iran over human rights abuses and brutal crackdowns on civilians. But after the Iranian regime ignored warnings and threatened brutal retaliation against any intervention, Trump saw no other option but to deploy intense military forces to capture Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei.
Just on that, though, you're referring to including being killed.
Yeah, including being killed. I don't think there would be tremendous. I don't think there would be tremendous outrage. This is a horrible regime. There would be a difference between being concerned about consequences and being concerned about the moral act of killing Khamenei. I don't think the moral act would be tremendously outrageous.
It's honestly hard to believe we're even looking at such a situation. This isn't just about one military operation or one regime change. We're talking about the potential end of decades of Iranian suffering, the risk of global conflict, and consequences that could reshape the entire Middle East. And trust me, the geopolitical fallout will tell you everything about how dangerous and unprecedented this intervention is. The stakes have never been higher, the military deployment more massive, and the consequences more unpredictable. Let me fill you in on the background that caused such an extraordinary situation and why this matters for understanding real-world geopolitics. Here's the scoop on how this timeline unfolded. Iran has been experiencing widespread protests and strikes against the regime. The government response has been brutal: mass executions, violent crackdowns on protesters, and thousands of civilians killed in the streets. International condemnation has been universal, but the violence only escalates. Trump issued direct warnings to the Iranian regime to stop the executions and brutal killings of civilians or face American intervention. But the Iranian government not only refused, but doubled down, threatening devastating retaliation if the U.S. dares to interfere in their internal affairs. Trump decided that saving millions of Iranian civilians from potential genocide requires immediate action. But this isn't just about stopping violence, it's about regime change. The plan was to capture Ayatollah Khamenei himself and end the Iranian people's suffering that has lasted for decades. The operation involved deploying massive ground forces alongside marine units approaching from the Persian Gulf, creating a two-front invasion designed to overwhelm Iranian defenses and secure the capital. According to what military sources report, the operation began with a massive air campaign designed to neutralize Iran's air defenses and command infrastructure. Stealth bombers and fighter jets would strike military installations across Tehran and other major cities, establishing air superiority before ground forces move in. The ground invasion was unprecedented in scale. Tens of thousands of American troops deploying from bases in neighboring countries, supported by armored divisions and special operations units with one primary mission: locate and capture Ayatollah Khamenei before he can escape or organize effective resistance. Talk about a military operation that would dwarf anything we've seen in the 21st century. Marine forces approached from the Persian Gulf, establishing beachheads along Iran's southern coast and pushing inland toward Tehran. The two-pronged approach was designed to divide Iranian military forces and prevent the regime from consolidating its defenses around the capital. According to how events unfolded, special operations teams had intelligence indicating Khamenei's location, likely in a heavily fortified compound in Tehran or a bunker system beneath the city. These elite units conducted the actual capture operation while conventional forces secured the surrounding areas and prevent regime loyalists from interfering. Reports described fierce resistance from Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps, who were fighting to protect their supreme leader, urban warfare in Tehran's streets, tank battles on the outskirts of the city, helicopter assaults on government buildings. The scale of combat was absolutely catastrophic. The capture itself happened after hours of intense fighting. Special forces breached Khamenei's compound, room-by-room searches, finally locating the 85-year-old supreme leader and taking him into custody without harming him. because Trump would want him alive to face justice. This wouldn't be the first time Trump has pursued regime change through direct military action. We'd look back at Trump's capture of Venezuelan President Maduro as the template for this operation. That precedent has established Trump's willingness to use military force to remove authoritarian leaders he views as threats to their own populations and to American interests. We'd see a pattern throughout Trump's presidency. Identify a regime engaged in human rights abuses. Issue warnings. When warnings are ignored, deploy overwhelming military force to achieve regime change. Frame it not as invasion, but as humanitarian intervention necessary to save civilian lives. This pattern would reveal something fundamental about Trump's foreign policy approach. Traditional diplomacy and sanctions are seen as insufficient when millions of lives hang in the balance. Direct action, even if controversial and potentially illegal under international law, becomes justified as a moral imperative. The parallel to the Maduro capture would be obvious. In both cases, authoritarian leaders brutalizing their own populations, international community condemning but taking no action. Trump deciding unilateral intervention is the only option, and the justification being framed around preventing further bloodshed and liberating oppressed people. Here's where things get really interesting and reveal the massive complexity of such an action. Trump would now face consequences from multiple directions, with geopolitical implications that could reshape global order for generations. The situation would break down starkly as Iranian resistance, even with Khamenei captured, Iran's military and Revolutionary Guard would continue fighting. Guerrilla warfare throughout Iranian cities, attacks on American forces. This occupation could drag on for years, making Iraq and Afghanistan look manageable by comparison. Casualties would mount into the thousands on both sides. Regional destabilization, Iran's allies, Hezbollah in Lebanon, militias in Iraq and Syria, Houthi rebels in Yemen, would launch retaliatory attacks. Israel could face unprecedented rocket barrages. American bases throughout the Middle East would be targeted. Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states might be drawn into a regional war that could engulf the entire Middle East. Then think about the global reaction. The international response would be swift and overwhelmingly negative. The United Nations Security Council would hold emergency sessions. Russia and China would condemn the invasion as illegal aggression and violation of Iranian sovereignty. Even traditional American allies in Europe would distance themselves, calling for immediate withdrawal. According to how events might play out, economic consequences would be devastating. Iran would immediately shut down the Strait of Hormuz, through which 20% of the world's oil supply passes. Oil prices would skyrocket to potentially $200 per barrel or higher. The global economy would face a crisis potentially worse than 2008. There would also be the nuclear question. Iran's nuclear facilities would need to be secured immediately to prevent materials from falling into the wrong hands or being used as dirty bombs by regime loyalists. The risk of nuclear terrorism would be unprecedented. Now here's the kicker. The capture of Khamenei would be causing effects beyond just Iran and the Middle East, with implications for international law, American standing in the world, and the future of global governance. America's traditional allies would be facing impossible choices. Do they support the U.S., despite viewing the invasion as illegal? Do they condemn their most important security partner? NATO might face its greatest crisis since formation, with members fundamentally divided over whether this action represents liberation or aggression. Russia and China would see this as an opportunity. They'd argue that American unilateralism proves the U.S. can't be trusted to respect international law or sovereignty. They'd use this invasion to justify their own actions, Russia in Ukraine, China regarding Taiwan. The precedent Trump sets would fundamentally undermine the post-World War II international order. Most significantly, the Iranian people themselves will have complicated reactions. Some would celebrate Khamenei's capture and the regime's fall, viewing Americans as liberators. But others, even those who oppose the regime, would resent foreign invasion and occupation. Nationalism would complicate what Trump would frame as humanitarian intervention. The domestic American reaction will be explosive. Democrats would move immediately to impeach Trump for what they'd call an unconstitutional act of war, launched without congressional approval. Massive protests would erupt across American cities. The country would be more divided than at any point since the Vietnam War. The financial cost would be staggering. Estimates would run into the trillions when accounting for the invasion, occupation, reconstruction, and long-term stabilization. This would be added to already massive national debt, potentially triggering a fiscal crisis. What happens after Khamenei's capture will determine whether this action proves to be liberation or catastrophe. The optimistic version is to see Iran rapidly stabilizing. With Khamenei removed and his hardline supporters neutralized, moderate Iranians could establish a democratic government. Free elections could be held. The country could move toward normalizing relations with the international community. Iranian citizens could experience freedoms denied for decades: freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, women's rights, economic opportunity. In this best-case version, you could see something like post-World War II Japan or Germany, an authoritarian regime defeated, followed by successful democratization and integration into the global community. Iran could become a prosperous, democratic partner rather than an isolated, hostile state. The Iranian people's incredible potential, their educated population, their rich culture, their strategic location, could finally be unleashed. But the pessimistic version is equally plausible. This could see Iraq War 2.0, but worse. Sectarian violence between different Iranian factions. Regional powers like Saudi Arabia and Turkey trying to establish influence, turning Iran into a proxy battleground. Insurgency against American forces dragging on for decades, the country fragmenting into warring factions. In this darker version, Khamenei's capture doesn't end the regime. It just decapitates it temporarily. Revolutionary Guard commanders continue fighting. Hardliners reorganize. Iran becomes ungovernable, requiring permanent American military presence at unsustainable cost in both money and lives. The capture could also trigger exactly what it's meant to prevent: broader regional war. Israel and Iran's proxies engage in devastating conflict. Saudi Arabia and Iran become locked in direct confrontation. American forces find themselves fighting on multiple fronts across the Middle East simultaneously. Closing summary, 60-90 seconds. Let's break down what this scenario teaches us about the complexity of military intervention and regime change. First, capturing Ayatollah Khamenei required a massive military operation involving hundreds of thousands of American troops, unprecedented air and naval power, and acceptance of significant casualties. The military challenge alone was immense. Second, the geopolitical consequences will be catastrophic in the short term. Regional war, global economic crisis, international condemnation, America's alliances strained to breaking point. These costs would be immediate and undeniable. Third, the long-term outcome remains unknowable. Would Iran emerge as a democratic success story, validating the intervention? Or would it become another endless quagmire, proving that regime change through force creates more problems than it solves? Here's the deal. Trump's decision to invade Iran and capture Khamenei would represent either the most consequential humanitarian intervention in modern history or the most catastrophic foreign policy disaster ever undertaken by an American president. There would be no middle ground. This scenario isn't just about Iran or Khamenei. It's about the limits of American power, the morality of humanitarian intervention, and whether removing brutal dictators through force can ever achieve lasting positive change. Watch for how the Iranian people respond to occupation, as liberators or invaders. Watch for whether regional powers escalate or pursue diplomatic solutions. Watch for whether America's economy and military can sustain such a massive, open-ended commitment. The stakes couldn't be higher, the consequences more unpredictable, or the moral questions more complex. This forces us to confront difficult questions about when intervention is justified, what America's role in the world should be, and whether good intentions can overcome the chaos that military action inevitably unleashes.